Morning to you all. Today's topic that we shall be discussing is pollination and fertilization. The first part is pollination. What is pollination? It is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a flower. What are its types? There are two types. Self-pollination, second, cross-pollination. Now, when we talk about self-pollination, also known as autogamy, it is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. You know, a flower is bisexual. That is, both the male and the female reproductive organ are present. So, the anthers are transferred to the stigma of the same flower. That is called as autogamy. Sometimes what happens, there are two different flowers of the same plant. So, when the transfer of pollen grains takes place from the anther of a flower to the stigma of another flower, but of the same plant, that is also self-pollination. Clear? Also known as gynecogamy. Now, what do we mean by cross-pollination? Here also, two flowers are involved. The transfer of pollen grains takes place between the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower, but of two different plants belonging to same species. For example, you have a rose garden. Now there are lots of rose plants, about 30 or 40. So what happens? The anther of one flower will be transferred to the stigma of another flower of the same area, but of the same species. Or it can be to far off places, but it will be rose variety only. So that is called as cross-pollination or allogamy. Now, when we talk about self-pollination, what are the conditions that are required for self-pollination? First one, the anther and stigma of the same flower should mature at the same time. If the flowers are unisexual, that means the male reproductive part and the female reproductive part are born on different flowers, then the anther and the stigma should mature at the same time. Clear? Now, what are the advantages of self-pollination? First of all, self-pollination, there is no requirement of any pollinating agent. That is either insects, wind, animals, etc. Secondly, what happens? The same parental traits or characters are passed down to the offspring. Clear? And it is a surer method of pollination. That means if a flower has both male and female reproductive part, anthers and stigma present, then in that case, self-pollination is a must. It will occur. Got it? Now, what are the disadvantages? Disadvantage of self-pollination is that the same variety are produced generation after generation. So, in that case, what happens? It leads to the weakening of the variety. Next, if the parents have got any defective traits, that is passed down to the younger generation or to the offsprings. Clear? Now, next we come to cross-pollination. Cross-pollination, one more advantage that I forgot to mention earlier was in the self-pollinated flowers, the flowers need not be large, showy or brightly colored. That comes under, that is, there is no pollinating agent required. When we talk about cross-pollination, what is the advantage? That is, new varieties are produced. The offspring produced are healthier, have more vigor, and they have the capacity to withstand harsh conditions or adverse conditions. The seeds produced also are viable, but it has got a very one of the drawback, most important drawback of cross-pollination is that the flowers have to depend on pollinating agent. So if the insects do not visit the flowers. In that case, the transfer of anthers cannot take place to the stigma of a flower. So, cross-pollination has this biggest drawback, that is, it requires pollinating agent. And then of course, the flowers have to be large, showy and brightly colored. Clear? Now, next we come, but when we observe, we find that it has been observed that nature favors cross-pollination. There are certain devices or contrivances that favors cross-pollination in flowers. What are those? Why do flowers, or why do we find cross-pollination more common? First of all, it is unisexuality. That means the flowers, they have either the male reproductive part or the female reproductive part. So, in that case, the cross-pollination is required to transfer the anthers to the stigma of the flower. Unisexuality. Clear? Next is dichogamy. Dichogamy means what? The anthers and the stigma have different time period of maturation. That means they do not mature at the same time. So, suppose this is one flower. It is bisexual flower. It has got stigma and anthers both. Anthers have matured, and even if they fall on the stigma, if the stigma is not mature enough to receive it, the pollen grains, the pollen are wasted. So in that case, cross-pollination is essential. So if the anthers mature first, then those type of flowers, we refer it as proto-andary. And if the stigma mature first, then the anthers, we say it proto-gynandry. Clear? Next that is term is heterostyly. What is hetero? Hetero means different. Now the anther and the stigma, they are enclosed within the calyx and corolla, especially the corolla or the petals. So the anthers, if the anthers and stigma grow at different heights, in that case the anthers are not transferred to the stigma of the flower. So that condition also makes the flowers depend or favor cross-pollination. Clear? Next is heterogamy. What happens in this? The anthers and the stigma mature at the same time. But what happens? The petals, they somehow form a hood or a structural barrier or a mechanical barrier. They cover the stigma of the flower. Got it? In such a way that even if the anthers, they mature, they cannot reach the stigma of the flower. So in that case also, we find that the flower has to depend on the process or the method of cross-pollination. Clear? Then we come to agents of pollinations. That is, what are the pollinating agent? It can be insects. So insect pollination, if done by insects like butterflies, honeybees, in that case we say the process as entomophily and the flowers entomophilous flowers. So what are the characteristic features of entomophilous flowers? You may be asked this term. So in that case you have to mention that flowers which are pollinated by insects. So in that case the flowers have to be bright, showy, should have nectar, they should be brightly colored, and the pollen grains, they should be produced in large numbers, and the stigma should be sticky so that they can receive the pollen, and the pollen should be edible so that the birds, they also come and visit the flowers and then help in pollination. Next you have pollination brought about by wind or air currents. That is called as anemophily, and the flowers are called as anemophilous. So what is the characteristic features of anemophilous flowers? The flowers are small, they need not be large, showy or brightly colored, but what is the most important features? That is, a large number of pollen grains should be produced and they should be light in weight. dry, smooth, so they can be easily carried by the air currents. And sometimes we find that in anemophilous flowers, the pollen grains are winged so that they can flow easily along with the air currents. The stigma are very long and they hang out of the flowers. Clear? Next, we have pollination brought about by water, that is called as hydrophyly, and the flowers pollinated by that is require the agent of water are called as hydrophilous flowers. So in that case, what happens? What do we find? That is the male flowers, they swim towards the female flowers and bring about pollination. Then what happens? The pollen grains, the specific gravity is almost equal to that of the water, so that they can float under the surface of water and reach the stigma of the that is the submerged plants. Clear? And of course the stigma, sometimes they hang out, they are very long and they hang out. Then there are other agents of pollination also, like if the pollination is done by animals, it is called as zoophily, and the flowers are called as zoophilous. Here also the flowers need to be bright, showy and large, and then the pollen grain should be edible. Then we have pollination brought about by elephants. So in that case, what do we find? The elephants pollinated flowers are called as elapophilous, and the method or the process called as elapophily. We have the flower Rafflesia, which is the largest flower in the plant kingdom, Rafflesia annulidi, found in the islands of Java and Sumatra. So what happens? These flowers grow at the ground level. So when the elephants walk, they happen to stamp on these flowers, and somehow these pollen grains get stuck to the lower part of the, that is foot of the elephant, and if they lift the flower at their foot, somehow the pollen grains get dropped onto the stigma of the flower, and then that way they bring about pollination. Pollination done by birds is called as ornithophyly, and the flowers are called as ornithophilous flowers. Pollination done by bat is called, process is called as chitrophily, and the flowers are called as chitrophilous flowers. So since bats are nocturnal, generally these flowers, they have the pollens are edible, and they are strong scented flowers. So they can locate the flowers by the smell. Clear? Now, the most recent method, that is pollination, is artificial pollination done by man, which is also called as hybridization. In that case, there are 3 steps. One is emasculation, removal of anthers, and then covering the flower with plastic bag, that is called as bagging, and then introducing the desired pollen into the emasculated flowers, which is called as hybridization. So that was all about this topic for today's session. Stay home, be safe. That is pollination. Then we have cross-pollination. controversies or devices that favors cross-pollination, such as unisexuality, dichogamy, sex sterility also. In that case, the pollen grains, even if they fall on the stigma, they fail to germinate. So in that case, the pollen of some other flower need to be deposited on the stigma. So that is also that favors cross-pollination. The agents of cross-pollination. What are the pollinating agents? According to your syllabus, you have to study in detail about the anemophilous flowers or the method, hydrophilous flowers and hydrophyly, and anemophilous flowers and anemophyly. Then we have certain terms